So I'm with Carbon Clean, and thank you very much again for having us participate in the virtual American Cement Conference. I'll be talking about scalable carbon capture for the cement industry. And I'm located just north of Houston, and I saw the poll question, which is fascinating, that came up just a little while ago about global CO2 trading. So thank you for that. So CO2, this is a challenge for a lot of industries. It's a challenge for the cement industry, surely. Part of my background was in oil and gas most recently. So there are a lot of industries where people are shifting around and looking at what the new, environmental requirements are going to require. And, so a lot of that creativity is going there. Cement is certainly the world's leading construction material, and it generates a big chunk of CO2 emissions, about 8%. And something which is a little bit intangible, but we know it's there, is that public opinion is driving a reduction in emissions. And there have been some studies that say, okay, how does that actually affect the shareholder value? And yeah, it can be 15% up or down, depending upon how a company is handling that. So it's definitely something to think about. And environmental legislation. So throughout the Americas, some parts a little bit different than others, but it's changing. It's a changing landscape very quickly. And so far, it's difficult for the industry to develop financial models, which is the most difficult thing to deal with, is the predictability. And the questions that I've been getting is, from very diverse industries, a lot from the cement industry, are people who say, we know we're going to need to do something on CO2 emissions and capture. We just don't know how much and when. Otherwise, it's a very easy to predict situation. The other thing is that the carbon capture itself has historically been challenged by cost and footprint. So let me just kind of go, looking at backing up. There's a term called carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with. The piece that I'm talking about is the carbon capture aspect itself. But there is a chain in this kind of value chain that starts with the combustion process or the industrial process. You've got a flue gas with CO2 in it. We're going to pull the carbon capture, we're going to pull the CO2 out of it. And then you've got the emissions with reduced CO2 going onto your stack. But you've got the concentrated CO2 gas that then is going to be compressed, transported somehow. Maybe it's by a pipeline or a barge or a truck, if it's liquefied. And then there are two paths. It either gets utilized, so it can go into all different kind of products, or it's going to go into long-term storage. So that's going to be deep underground where it stays for thousands of years. It could be, so that's sequestration, or it could be enhanced oil recovery. So it's actually used and ultimately stays underground that way. And what my company, Carbon Clean, is doing is trying to address and revolutionize the industrial carbon capture. By that I mean it's the not the mega emitters, but it's significant. It's a big chunk, measurable. For the cement industry, it's 8% of the global emissions. But we want to go after some key challenges. And one of those is it's too expensive. In the past, anything was too expensive for CO2 capture unless you were actually using the CO2. And we're going to drive the cost per ton down. Some of the very typical metrics these days are well over $100 per ton on carbon capture, but we're going to drive it down dramatically. The other thing is the site constraints, the area constraints at a brownfield site or even a greenfield. It's expensive. So you have to drive the footprint down. Excuse me, please. The reason to go after it is and pursue it is that it's a big market. So it's going to be growing dramatically. I mean, 2030 is kind of an initial point where many of these targets are being set that say you have to have a certain amount of CO2 reduction by 2030. At that point, it's going to be about 527 million tons globally. But by 2050, it's like 5 times that much. The cement industry is going to be a big part of the CO2 capture market, and it's going to be, in the next 20 years, over $100 billion per year for the capture and storage segment. So what we're talking about here is a post-combustion amine solvent carbon capture process. And this process has been around for decades, quite honestly, and it's been improved, optimized. What we do is, employing this process, we have a higher CO2 absorption rate through our solvents that have been developed, and an overall fantastic environmental performance, above kind of the industry standards, and the energy use, I think, is a real advantage. But the way that this thing works, and many people, I'm sure, are very familiar with this, but you've got the flue gas that's coming in down here on the bottom left. It runs through a cooler. It then goes up into an absorber column. So this is where you've got the solvent. It's an amine solvent that's flowing down. And then you've got the flue gas, which is going up, and there's a transfer of the CO2. It loads the solvent. It's then a rich solution. The cleared gas, it goes back to the atmosphere, so at that point with a much reduced CO2. So the CO2-rich solvent from the absorber then passes through a heat exchanger in the middle where it's partially heated. It goes on to a regen unit or stripper. There is a reboiler that can use a variety of heat sources. But this heated solution then cycles through the stripper, releases the CO2 from the rich solution, and then that goes through another cold water wash, and there's a pure stream of CO2 that goes out. Then you've got a lean solution, which is coming out of the stripper, and it kind of makes its journey back around and just does a cycle. All right, so what does our company actually offer? What do we do? We started out and absolutely still do this, but it was the solvent technology, and our trade name is CCUS, and the technology and the know-how of implementing a plant. So this is proven, it's demonstrated. Large plants at reduced CapEx can be implemented. It's available now. There's this next phase, which is also available now, and that is for those that are either have a smaller requirement or they're getting their feet wet, getting familiar with using carbon capture. So it's familiarizing your operations teams and just kind of like what the overall value chain looks like. But these are semi-containerized compact units, and kind of in the range of 5 to 40 ton per day, which is a smaller size. And since they're fabricated in a shop off-site, hauled in, there's reduced site installation activity, and these are available now. And then finally, I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what's coming next and some of our next generation modules. Again, this is about being able to install the CO2 capture in a simple way, and a low-cost way, and to get to some of the higher capacities. And I'll talk about what that CycloneCC really is. But this is where you're really going to get a significant size reduction in the equipment, and that's just super important when you're thinking about deploying that onto your site. All right, so the next generation, the CycloneCC, what is it? It's taking a column like this, which can be, significant, and then replacing it with this type of a form factor. It's a rotating packed bed, essentially. So you've got also a solvent. It's a slightly different formula. Apologies. But it is a much smaller device that can then go into one of these containers. And it's going to enable a fully skid-mounted or containerized design. We're in our second generation of testing right now. And that's basically scaling up, so making the equipment higher capacity, testing it out, improving it. So this is going to be 100% modular type approach. So we're what had been a startup company transitioning into a larger company. We're based in the UK, but we're growing a great deal of focus in North America and in the Americas. But we've had, some of these dots here were our Department of Energy grants, where we're building and deploying at some partner sites. Much of our projects have been in Europe, in Germany in particular, just because, that's just where the focus has been. It's where the incentives have been the most. So people are motivated to move. History of the company. So where we came from was actually started in 2009 with this APBS solvent that I was referring to. It achieved its first 4,000 operating hours during 2012. There was a UK grant behind that. In 2016, the first fully commercialized industrial carbon capture and storage facility was built. So this was captured to utilization at some awards. Last year, there were some 40 operating units, 800,000 ton per annum CO2. We had our second round equity investment, some good partners that were involved in that, some good JVs that I'll talk about as well. And then into the next couple of years, the next generation technology will be fully released, 100% modular, and getting down some of those lower price points. So, there are a few project highlights that I wanted to point to, and these are press releases that have happened. So it is, there's a lot of activity. This first one I'm going to talk about is at CEMEX. And earlier this year, in January, I think there was an announcement by the Department of Energy that they were awarding a grant. CEMEX is part of this. We're part of it. RTI is actually the prime on this project, Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And it's going to be developing and deploying some really revolutionary carbon capture application. And so what's the objective? Is to increase efficiencies and value in the production process, optimizing and scaling up the technology for their specific requirements, next generation solvents, and new utilization. So this whole project, it's got a goal of a simplified carbon capture deployment at a reduced cost. And that's going to be a very important achievement for the cement sector. It's going to be hosted at a CEMEX facility in California. Here is a project with LafargeHolcim in Europe. It is in Spain, actually. So they're partnering with us on this large-scale carbon capture and utilization application. And I wanted to kind of talk about the use, even though we're not directly managing that. So again, we're doing the carbon capture technology, but what do you do with the CO2? The question that comes up a lot. So here's one that it's going to an agricultural use. So what that does, it's applied in greenhouses. Today, pretty broadly, about putting CO2 in, but it increases a farm output so that for the same amount of water and soil, you get more product. And that's what this is about. So, you know, they have a path to where they could go to full decarbonization, starting smaller, of course, but again, very interesting. And here's a company, Dalmia Cement. So in 2019, they decided that they wanted to team up with us to develop the technology for one of their facilities. And this is, again, using CEMEX. And they're also investigating how can they use the CO2, you know, either by marketing that directly or partnering with others. One more project highlight, the last one that I'll mention here, but a company in India. So this is Tuticorin Chemical, and this is the world's first low-cost industrial scale carbon capture and utilization facility. Now, they have a coal-fired boiler, and what they're doing is pulling a slipstream off of that, and they're capturing CO2. Their situation was that they need soda ash for their product, and they were seeing a lot of price fluctuations. So it was, you know, sometimes they'd be competitive, other times it was a challenge. So they're generating this CO2 themselves, which they can then convert to soda ash, and they're achieving, you know, some really fantastic benchmarks, less than $40 a ton. They're meeting all of their performance and cost objectives, and, you know, it turns into a green product ultimately. Then I just want to finish and say that where we are in our growth path, we've got some strategic partnerships. We're looking for more, certainly within each of those 4 verticals that I referred to. We're going to have a couple of those in each one. You'll see some names you probably recognize on this page. We've had some important investment partners, and you know, allowing us to introduce and achieve new business models and grow at the pace that is going to be needed.